This is APUSH review for Chapter 14, Imperialism in World War I. The first thing we're going to look at is the causes of American imperialism between the years 1890 and 1919. So, as far as causes go, there's really five main ones you need to concern yourself with. The first one is something called guerrilla journalism, and we'll look at that here in just a second. The second is naval policies, and the main one that you need to concern yourselves with is from Alfred Thayer Mahan, when he's talking about that it's essential to be a world power that you have a strong navy. Number three is European imperialism. Now, if you look over here on this map on the left, you can see that by 1900, most of Africa has been carved up by European powers through something called the Berlin Conference. Okay. Number four, the emphasis of social Darwinism, and five, the moral improvement of bringing civilization to less technologically advanced people. As far as wars go with the Spanish-American War, you need to be worried about the causes and consequences. The causes were two. First of all was the bombing of the battleship Maine, and second was the rise of yellow journalism or sensationalist journalism by a couple of publishers in New York named Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Basically, that's what these guys are doing, is putting sensationalist, like overly exaggerated headlines on their newspapers to draw eyeballs to it, because if more people see it and it catches their attention, they're more likely to buy your paper. Out of the consequences of the Spanish-American War, the big one is the territorial acquisitions. If you look on the map once again, you can see where some of these places are. First of all, we've got Puerto Rico down in the Caribbean. We have Cuba down there as well, and then we have Guam and the Philippines outside of Southeast Asia over here on this side of the map. Now, you may be responsible for finding these places on a map at some point, so it'd be a good idea to go over this again. We'll move forward to one of the big things that came out of the Spanish-American War, and it was a debate over the annexation of the Philippines. Now, like on any debate, you have two sides to it. You have the anti-imperialist debate, or isolationist, as you might see it referred to, and also those that were for annexation of the Philippines. As far as the arguments for each go, the Anti-Imperialist League was basically against colonizing places or annexing them because we were founded on the principles of liberty and freedom and things like that. People who were for annexation of the Philippines argued that we had a moral responsibility to go out and, if you will, tame the savage, okay, civilize the islands, bring Christianity, culture, society, etc. that we enjoyed over here to take that over there. And also, kind of the underlying reason for this was also they would be an ideal trading partner because of their location relative to China and Asia and places like that. We move from there to the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, here's the bottom line on this. If you remember, the Monroe Doctrine was set up to keep Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere, specifically Mexico, Central America, and South America. Roosevelt comes out with his corollary in response to the fact that Latin American nations were having trouble paying their debts back to European banks, and he was worried if they defaulted on these loans, Europe would get involved militarily in an attempt to collect these debts. So what he does is basically comes out with this to what it says, forestall European intervention. In other words, to keep Europe out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. So comes out with it, he sets us up kind of in the role of an international police power and goes on from there. It wouldn't be a bad idea to know the quote under number 5 because you may see it as part of a DBQ or as a multiple choice question. Going from there to dollar diplomacy, which is under the presidency of Taft. The bottom line on it is using economic investments to bolster American foreign policy. So using business dollars to help our relations with other nations. The next thing on our list is the open door policy. When you hear open door policy, you need to know that it refers to Asia. Okay, just kind of the background on it. Up to this time, China and other places in Asia hadn't necessarily been colonized by European powers, but what they had done is carved out spheres of influence where they controlled trade, had political leverage, and obtained exclusive commercial privileges. Now, we knew we could not force Europeans to leave China, but what we wanted to do, and the bottom line on it, is that we wanted access to those markets. We wanted to be able to do business over there. So, in 1899, Secretary of State John Hayes sends out a note that calls for open access to China, particularly for us. Moving from imperialism to World War I, the first thing you need to know about the U.S. in World War I is at the beginning of the war, we take a position of neutrality. In other words, we're not really going to get involved in it because it's happening exclusively in Europe. And it's happening over there for the reasons you can see in the little chart we have on the left side. Now, you don't need to know every specific one, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to familiarize yourself with some of the reasons why war breaks out in Europe. Now, we start to edge a little bit away from neutrality once Germany institutes a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. Now, the reason that's important to us is because when they're attacking ships with their submarines, it's merchant ships. All right, it's things like that. So we're worried that they're eventually going to be bombing or sinking our merchant ships or the things that we're using to trade goods with Europe. One of the things that gets us involved in World War I, other than the fact that Germany had adopted this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, was something called the Zimmermann Telegram, which comes out once it's released. It's a huge firestorm in America. Basically what it boils down to is it was a telegram from the German minister in Mexico. And what he's telling Mexico is that if they form an alliance with Germany and help them basically conquer us, then Germany would allow Mexico to recover the lands that they lost during the Mexican-American War, which is basically, as you can see right here, different map, but same point. It's basically the southwestern states, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, etc. Moving forward from there to World War I at home, and that's really where our focus is going to be. And the first thing we've got to deal with is the black migration. Now, once again, causes and consequences of it. So really the causes on this is what you need to worry about. Causes, number one, in the South, we talked about Jim Crow laws and what they did to African Americans, about denying their rights and having them to continue to live under poverty and things like that. With World War I, demand for industrial goods really begins to rise in northern factories. So when that happens, that opens up tons of jobs for people. That's just not, the North's not able to supply that demand. So what happens is many people begin to, and talking about African Americans here, begin to leave the South and go to the northern industrial areas, as you see right here. So if you see this map with a lot of arrows pointing north, you need to know it probably refers to the Great Migration during the period of World War I. Another thing on the home front is Committee on Public Information. Wouldn't be a bad idea to know that it was headed up by a guy named George Creel, and it deals with propaganda for the American war effort. Now remember, propaganda is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just simply trying to get your point across and trying to get people on whatever side or wherever people having your back. So it was used to arouse public support for the war and to stifle dissent. Basically what these guys did is went out and spoke on city streets. They did commercials, viewings before movies, stuff like that, to get the message out of what the U.S. was trying to do with the war effort. So we're moving from there to the end of World War I and the results that come out of it. And remember, we didn't really have a big military impact on World War I. Ours was mainly, once our troops got involved, it was the demoralizing factor to Germany and its allies. So with the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I, the big thing you need to know from our perspective is Wilson's 14 points. And you should know a lot about this because you did a DBQ on it. So with the 14 points, you don't necessarily need to know every point, but as far as what it does have, the 14th one is really the important one for our purposes. It's the creation of an international organization to preserve the peace and security of its members. In other words, we're talking about the League of Nations. Okay, so you need to know that as well as what it did not include, and that's the recognition of Allied economic and territorial agreements made during the war and a provision to create the International Monetary Fund. Now, the ironic thing about the Treaty of Versailles is even though we took the lead on it, we ourselves did not ratify the treaty. If you recall from that DBQ, there was extreme Senate opposition for it. There was also some missteps on Wilson's part. So as far as the Senate opposition, you need to know that. You need to know who led it, and it was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. All right, and the reason that they opposed it is because they did not want to join an international organization because it would more or less impede on our ability to stay out of European affairs. In other words, it would kind of kill our isolationist position if we're required by the terms of the League of Nations to get involved in things that we don't necessarily have a hand in. Moving from there to some of the issues, the Red Scare, you need to know it comes from the Bolshevik Revolution, which was led by Lenin, and it's in Russia. And when this happens, communism begins to spread, and we're really worried about it coming over here. The main result at first to the spread of communism, now remember there's two different waves of this. There's after World War I and there's after World War II. So after World War I, the Palmer raids are one of the big things that come out of this first Red Scare. And once again, it's caused by the fear of communism and radicalism. Basically what it is an attempt to purge out these radical elements in American culture. So one of the things they do for your purposes is disregarded basic civil liberties, and the result of it, over 4,000 people were jailed, and a lot of people were essentially shipped out of the country back to Russia. Alright, this concludes chapter 14. We'll move on to 15 and keep on rolling on this thing.